Podcast. Used Car News is your top source for fast and reliable news that car dealers can rely on for this evolving industry. Here are this month's top stories. Industry live events returned in a challenging year. A Colorado dealers group raised $422,000 for charity. And we remember the industry giants that were lost in 2022. But first, we sit down with Melinda Zabritsky, Experience Director of Financial Solutions.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Ballant. I am Managing Editor of Used Car News, and this is the Used Car News Podcast. Got a great guest today. We've got Melinda Zabritsky, Senior Director of Automotive Finance for Experience. And they just came out recently with the last couple of weeks, their third quarter report. And it is their reports, if you ever see them, are outstanding for all things auto finance. And just as a little pitch, our upcoming data source book that Used Car News puts out every year, and they've done it always, except for during COVID. Now it's all digital. And Experian has always been a partner providing great information. And obviously some of this will go into that report as well. So keep an eye out for both Experian's report and, of course, Experian's information in the data source book upcoming before the end of the year. So, Melinda, interesting report as always. I always appreciate your insight. If you could kick us off with just your general insights into what you see in the third quarter, and try and keep it from an independent perspective, but obviously include new and other issues, but just independence if there's anything that jumps out on that end.
Sure. Thanks, Jeffrey. So Q3 2022, we saw a lot of continuation of the elements that we saw in the second quarter. Most notably, we continue to see very elevated loan amounts for new and used. The positive on the used side is some of that growth, that very dramatic growth that we had been seeing is starting to taper off. Our prices and values are still elevated, but that does seem to be slowing down. Also, especially on the used car side, the subprime space has still really failed to fully bounce back after COVID. We're still originating some lower amounts in the subprime space. And I think one of the things that is most notable that we saw in the third quarter was the skyrocketing market share for credit unions. Credit unions now the leading lender type with over 31% share of all the used financing that we saw for Q3.
Yeah, it's funny. We've talked in the past, and it seems that has always seemed to be a trend. And like you said, now it's completely off the charts. And I've asked you this before, but for the podcast, what is it about that? Is this as much credit unions being aggressive or lenders falling back, or what is that all about?
Well, for the credit union share, it really boils down to those rate increases. We have the rate increases coming out. The banks responded very quickly. Their rates started to increase very steadily. The credit unions were a little slower to start raising their rates. Now, in the past couple months, we're seeing the rates pick up again. They are increasing for the credit unions, but they're still offering lower rates than what the banks are. Excellent.
Great. Now, one of the big things that jumped out at me from your summary report was the issue of delinquencies this time around in this quarter. Can you tell me about that?
Well, just like we saw last quarter, we did see some delinquencies increase, especially year over year. 2020, 2021, we saw very low levels of delinquency. Government payments were being made. We had accounts that were frozen, et cetera. Right now, we are seeing delinquency go back to pretty much some of those pre-COVID levels. So pretty much on par with what we saw back in 2018 and 2019.
What's the benefit of that? Or that sounds weird to say benefit, but I mean, anything that brings a little normalcy, is that what can dealers or lenders take from that, I guess?
Well, certainly, again, kind of getting to some of those quote unquote normal type levels. I think one of the things that I increasingly hear from both dealers and lenders when it comes to the delinquency isn't necessarily an issue with managing any potential losses, because with the vehicle values being so high, any losses are kind of being mitigated with those, again, the collection vehicles, the repos, et cetera. It's higher. The bigger issue I'm hearing from folks is more of a labor shortage in having the resources to go out and repo vehicles.
Oh, okay. That is interesting. I mean, that's a struggle in a lot of areas, but that's one I wouldn't have thought of off the top of my head. And what about in the different credit segments on the used car side, prime to deep subprime? Are you seeing any trends there?
So again, volume is still low in those areas. It seemed, and this has been really since COVID, it seems that your more prime consumer recovered very quickly. The volume is still off for those areas, but it's the subprime space that seems to have been hit harder, where we just haven't seen volume fully come back yet.
Okay. Okay. And I assume that has to do with just interest rates and costs and just living, or what?
It very likely could be tied to all of that. You know, we have just such high levels of loan amounts and such high demand for used vehicles that, you know, those loan amounts and those values are up really across the space. And then for your deep subprime type consumer in the used car space, you know, a handful of years ago, those loan amounts were 13, 14,000. Now the loan amounts are, you know, 20, 24,000. So that's led to some pretty big differences and pretty big increases in those monthly payments.
For sure. You know, I mentioned, I don't know, I had this question in a different order, but in terms of the credit union involvement, does that affect the used car space much?
Well, that's where we're seeing the credit unions do a lot of growth. When you look at the credit union space, most of what they finance are used cars. You know, credit unions do about 70% of their originations are used cars, whereas banks are like around 60%. Now, this is where we have seen then credit unions become the number one segment for used cars. And they do a lot of financing in the independent space, but most of their originations will be with franchise. But they do about a quarter, or roughly about 1 in 5 of the independent loans are done by credit unions.
Okay, cool. Excellent. Now, I mentioned this, and for listeners, I'm going to refer to something that's visual, but Linda can explain it, I think. A graphic, a slide 35 in the Q3 report is something interesting. I didn't understand, or it kind of struck me. Can you explain what that slide's about? Describe for listeners what information it's providing.
Sure. So this particular graphic takes a look at the different risk segments, the 5 different risk tiers from deep subprime, subprime, near prime, prime, and super prime. And it's a 3-year trend where we look at each of those risk segments and the percentage of time each of the segments purchases a used vehicle or finances a used vehicle compared to a new. So for example, if we look at our deep subprime segment, these are consumers with credit scores up to 500. And it's essentially showing that 96% of the time, these consumers finance a used vehicle. Whereas if you look at super prime consumers, these are credit scores of 780 and above, they're choosing to finance a used vehicle 46% of the time. But essentially what we see in this little trend line is leading up to COVID, we had increasingly been seeing our prime and super prime consumers increasingly opting for used vehicles, and even super prime purchasing used over half of the time. So you had these very strong credit scoring consumers who, instead of buying a new car, were out adding used cars, purchasing used cars. And that trend kind of shifted a little bit with COVID, especially in 2020, 2021, where you still had a lot of new car incentives. We saw pull these super prime consumers back into the new car market. Now, despite inventory shortages and a lack of incentives by the captives, for Q3, we actually saw a decrease in the percentage of prime and super prime consumers purchasing used. So despite all the difficulty getting new cars, your higher credit scoring consumers were starting to go back to new cars compared to what they were last year. Whereas your subprime, deep subprime consumers were increasingly purchasing used vehicles.
Yeah. Now on the prime, super prime, that's interesting. My guess is it because they're very prudential shoppers or whatever, that the value is, that have something to do with the values of the used going up to a point where maybe they don't see the value like they did before?
I think that's a lot of it. You have the fact that, used values are up so much. Of course, on the new vehicle side, I think consumers are still facing dealer markups. But if you think about it also, if these are consumers who maybe they purchased their most recent vehicle 3 or 4 years ago, they've been paying down that loan, and now that vehicle sitting in their driveway has a very high used car value. So now there's increased equity in that vehicle that perhaps for these consumers, it's offsetting the dealer markup, or it's giving them more money in their car to go in and put towards a new vehicle.
Very good. Okay, excellent. I didn't thought about that. That's a good thought. So now, of course, the big thing now and and I haven't, now I'm doing this on my phone, so I don't have the news in front of me, but the inflation and interest rates increases, and I know the Fed's doing their thing now. What are you seeing? How is that affecting what you're seeing in the auto finance space, especially, I guess, for used car dealers?
Well, it's definitely leading to some record high loan amounts, that's for sure. We're seeing monthly payments go up now on the used car side to around $525. Rates are up now into the low 9% range for the entire used market. Obviously it's up across all the different risk segments. Every single risk segment has shown a rate increase, but it's also led to used terms extending out a little bit more than what some of those year-over-year increases we had been seeing. Right now, we're showing average used term to now a little over 68 months. And to kind of show a comparison of that, just a handful of years ago, it was in the low 60 months. So more and more of the used car loans at 72 months or higher, and 72 months has pretty much become the norm for a used car loan.
Cheapers. And then you think about, and then you look on the delinquencies or the repo side, boy, that, and meaning not finding help to do those, that's a tough situation. Holy cow. And, one of the things we talked about before is the whole weirdness of the loan to value on used cars, the way all of a sudden for a while there, it had been upside down for what it normally was. What's the situation on loan to values on the used car side?
Well, for used car loan to value, that LTV, we're actually showing it come down. It's been steadily dropping for the last couple of years, and one of the rarities that we see in the industry is with the increased value that used cars are having at the auction, and again, consumers having more equity in their trade-in because of those higher values. It's rare that we've seen used LTV lower than new. But that's been the case for the last couple quarters, really past about last year or so, is those used LTVs just dropping for most consumers.
Yeah, that was one of the things that jumped out at me when we talked earlier the year. And so that's still continuing. Wow, even with everything going on, that's interesting. It's the one interesting thing of all the ups and downs we've seen over the last couple of years. I was looking at that one chart that talked about the percentage or whatever of buy here, pay here financing. It is just a flat line almost. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, so the buy here, pay here space, continues to be a relatively small part of the market. Now it's obvious it's a bigger portion of the used car market, but for the total market, buy here, pay here tends to be around 10. And it does tend to be very consistent. A lot of the lenders in this space are very long lived, and in the used car space, it's closer to around 16%. But again, not a whole lot of variation to the share for this market. And in part, it's because it's a very consistent consumer, buy here, pay here, much larger percentages of subprime. It's not subject to as much of just a buy box changes that the other lenders have as other lenders start, increasing their buy box or decreasing their buy box. Buy here, pay here is a very steady share of the market and very steady buying type parameter.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes was when COVID was early on hit and everything was crazy and people were saying, "Oh my gosh, all this crisis and everything. What are customers doing?" And I talked to a buy here, pay here consultant. He's no. Our customers live in this space every day. Every day is like this. So for them, it was no different, And actually, it was obviously better because they got more government money and they were flush. So that was kind of interesting. So in your Q3 summary, and you might have talked a little bit about this earlier, you mentioned leasing rates fell under 20% of new financing. How was that? Is that a milestone? Is that something you've seen before?
Leasing definitely taken a hit over the last couple years. Well under 20% now. I'm seeing leasing about 18% or so of the entire new space. To put that in perspective, a couple years ago, 27, 28%.
Yeah.
And even if you go back to some of the years, pre-COVID, if you look at 2019, 2018, 2017, you would see leasing in the upper to mid 30%. So
Jeez, yes, I remember that.
yeah, big impact there, going from 1 in 3 new cars being leased to now, 1 in 5, and steadily dropping.
And this might not be your wheelhouse, but from the manufacturer side, is that a good or bad thing? I know they like to keep the factories flowing, but also, does that affect how they think?
Well, so much of the leasing emphasis certainly being pushed by the manufacturer. And if you think about it as just another type of incentive,
right,
there's really no need for incentives to move metal. Metal's
Gotcha.
moving itself. I wouldn't expect to see leasing really make that much of a comeback until all the inventory issues sorted out, supply demand starts catching back up again. I think at that time we'll start to see, increases in leasing again. But until then, I would expect to continue to see leasing at these lower levels.
And that's going to affect values, obviously, going forward in terms of supply, right? Or no? Or is it those things are going to convert to sales? Meaning,
again,
in other words, if there's less leasing, is there going to be more sales, I guess?
Well, you would, yes, certainly. As long as the demand is there, yes, you're going to see those sales taking place as more of a loan or, some cash transactions. One of the bigger impacts, I think, around the leasing is with the inventory constraints. Not only do we see leasing on the retail side low, but also the prioritization of retail versus fleet, because a lot with fleet being down from the new manufacturing side, that also impacts, that steady stream of late model used vehicles coming back to the market in 2 to 3 years. So that continues to have some of that constraint that the used car market will be dealing with in the years to come.
And again, this isn't your primary focus, but do you hear from your people what the fleet market's going to be like in a year or two? Is anybody predicting that?
We do not do predictions. I think those steady numbers is, from what we're seeing in just the pure registration data, we continue to see fleet at lower levels. Again, I think predicting where that will return to more normalized levels, I think will be in line with whatever predictions we see for total SARs kind of getting back up to, those 16 type figures.
I got you. Yeah. And to be honest with you, nobody's going to hold anybody accountable for predictions anymore, because I think over the last 10 years, it doesn't matter. Everybody can predict anything. How can you predict what's happened? And tell me a little bit about the types of things being leasing and the new financing. You list like the top 10 finance vehicles are all trucks, SUVs, CUVs. I know that's been the trend. Do you see any change? Is it more or less the same?
We usually see a mix where it is heavier weighted towards SUVs, CUVs in the top leased vehicles, but usually there's a couple sedans in the top 10. And for Q3, there weren't. Again, it was 3 or 4 full-size pickup trucks, and then the rest being those SUVs, CUVs. We do continue to also see, when you just look at total financing, those SUVs are now over 60% of all the new cars that consumers are buying. And it's been in the upper 50% for the last couple of years, but now we're a little over 60. And of course, those become our used cars of the future. So, your 2 to 3 year old model vehicles coming back to the market will also increasingly be SUVs, CUVs, and those pickups.
That'll be interesting, because obviously that's going to be a higher price vehicle, and that affects a lot of stuff as well. Interesting. What about term lengths of leasing? Like, my wife and I recently did a lease, and it was 2 years, where in the past we've done 3 years, and it wasn't necessarily our choice. This is what they were offering. Is there a trend or change in lease term lengths?
On average, there really hasn't been. The average term has stayed pretty steady in that
Mm,
36-month range. So any
gotcha.
deviation from that could just be based on whatever the manufacturer is focused on. And again, trying
Right.
to control the return of vehicles. But not only
Right.
that, but also trying to control for setting that residual, where certainly in the current market, a 2-year residual might be easier to set than a 3-year.
You know, it's funny. It wasn't on my list, but that is a great question. When I started out just years ago, I always laughed. I thought, boy, I'm not a gambler, but betting on football and setting residuals for a car seems kind of like the same thing.
In today's value market, I can certainly say that I am very glad I'm not responsible for setting any residuals.
It's always like it's either too high or too low, and you can't blame them. I remember there was always an issue at the trade shows, panels discussing it, and it's like, and that was when things were normal, and it's just like, holy cow! And now you can't predict supply chains and all that. Also, anything else that jumps out at you in terms of other things that you've learned in this third quarter compared to, say, first quarter, second quarter trends coming from the beginning of the year, say?
Yeah, so certainly in more of a year-to-date view of the market, many of the trends have been consistent. That increased loan amount on new vehicles being, accelerating at a faster rate than MSRP. But on the used car side, again, we're starting to see a bit of a tapering off of that. While the used values are still elevated, the increases haven't been as much as what we've seen in the past. And in fact, Q3 compared to Q2, we actually even saw as a percentage, the quarter over quarter, there was a decrease in the average loan amount quarter over quarter for used. So starting to see a little bit of a leveling off and a tapering off on that.
Boy, yeah, thank goodness, right? We kind of needed that. And I'll bounce back, and I might be repeating myself or making you repeat yourself. On the credit ratings or the segments, the deep subprime, what has been the trend on that on the used again?
So the trends on deep subprime for used has been steadily decreasing. We did see a slight increase in the percentage of deep subprime in Q3, but even though the share has increased a little, the volume still is lower than especially some of our pre-COVID levels. So we're still seeing some constraints down in subprime and especially deep subprime for used loans.
And I'm going to ask you this because I think I probably typically ask you this when this about this issue. What is that attributed to? Is it people falling out of the market or falling into buy here, pay here, or is it loan availability, I guess?
So I think part of that volume decrease ties into some of those elevated prices and just supply demand on the used car side. It really tied straight in with the market recovery kind of post-COVID. It does include buy here, pay here. What it does require is it does require us to be able to calculate a credit score on the consumers.
Oh, okay.
But it is looking at just the entire scored population of people who are purchasing vehicles, as well as getting loans. So some of that volume decrease very well could be loans going into buy here, pay here, where it's smaller dealers who perhaps might not be able to report data to bureaus, in which case we would not be able to track and trend some of that. So some of that volume decrease very well could be a shift into buy here, pay here.
What do you suspect it is? Is it just not buying or?
I suspect it's consumers being kept out of the market or just not fully returning to the market yet.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Any other things that jump out at you regarding on the used car side?
I think we hit a lot of the main ones. The bigger things on the used car side, certainly that increased credit union share. Credit unions still increasing their share both within franchise stores as well as in independent stores. And again, those increases in the loan terms to help attempt to offset some of those rate increases that we certainly saw for Q3 and will continue to see this year.
Cool. And when you talk to people, say people in the industry, dealers, are you getting questions or concerns that show up more than anything else? I mean, what are some of the things that you get asked a lot about?
Of course, everyone wants to try to forecast, which of course is not something that we do. I think there's been more concern, especially on the used side and the independent side, about kind of the right sizing of the car values that are in the lots. Of course, as the auction values start coming down a little bit, there are many dealers out there who have, cars on the lot that are that they paid more for than the kind of the current auction values are.
Yeah.
And so, of course, I think there's discussion around that. But really, mostly what I hear is, again, discussions around affordability, those term extensions, and how to add more credit unions to the portfolio.
Oh, okay. Yeah, cool. It's funny too. You think about what you're hearing from dealers, what I've heard from dealers, even from early in the year, is like they all remember the Great Recession when they are all stuck with cars they spent a lot. And there was a little bit of that during that gas thing in 2008, 2010, where everybody kind of automatically went from SUVs to cars, but it switched so fast, and I know the dealers lost money on that. And now I'm telling you, dealers at the beginning of this, and I know the economists and the forecasters are saying they think it's going to be a little bit more softer leveling than like it was, or like dealers fear. But boy, dealers are afraid of that, because you're right. They spend a lot of money for these used cars, and they are very scared about that thing falling off a cliff too quickly. So I talked to a dealer who does a lot of business, and he's like, boy, he's very massaging how he buys and sells. Like he's not buying, he's trying to sell as many cars as he wants, but he's really not, he's afraid to get too many on the lot that, when things go south. Do you hear from the people, not you guys necessarily, but the experts you talk to, it sounds like you're hearing the same thing I'm hearing, that we don't expect it for what that's worth, that it's going to be like a big drop.
That's what I'm hearing mostly. And I think the independent side faces a slightly different situation than necessarily a full late model or franchise dealer, in that, in the independent side, the cars that most of the consumers, especially your subprime consumer, are looking for are cars. And to keep that affordability, it's tending right now towards an older model year vehicle. Whereas, a handful of years ago, kind of that sweet spot was, a 3 to 5 year old vehicle. And now it's more of a 7 to 10 year old vehicle. So you've got a different mix in the top demand cars in this space. And again, I specifically say cars, which that also, if you're not necessarily doing your own financing, it definitely brings a different kind of lender mix that an independent store needs to have, because each of the lenders will of course have a different model year buy box. You might have a bank that maybe does subprime, but they won't go beyond a 8-year-old model vehicle, versus maybe a credit union that'll finance older, or a finance company that'll specialize in 10 to even 15-year-old vehicles. So I think it also changes that kind of mix, because with the prices being elevated, it changes what cars consumers can afford. So it definitely brings that different mix.
Right, because that's what they're more concerned about, than the type of vehicle. I mean, generally speaking, right? So I'm going to ask you something I didn't prep you for, but then you should be okay on this. My question is, Melinda, what do you like best about your job? What's most interesting about your job working in this space?
Well, I really enjoy digging into the numbers and tracking and trending what we're seeing in the market, and then really getting that firsthand experience from lenders and dealers of kind of that validation of, yes, this is what I see in this macro view, but then being able to have clients and other folks in the industry really give more of that personalized story to it. Just to me helps bring this data and brings the numbers to life.
That's a great point. It helps you. I'm sure it helps you understand what you're looking at too, because like you said, if you get caught up in the numbers, then you want to know what it means. Obviously, talk to people like me, so you can explain it to me. What's the hardest part about your job?
I think sometimes it's finding what specific elements to really focus on. There's all sorts of interesting things you can pick and choose to focus on, and there's lots of ways to get lost in the numbers. So I think sometimes it's digging out of that rabbit hole of just going too far deep of finding one trend that looks interesting and keep on going, and it turns out to be something that maybe is irrelevant. So sometimes I think the difficult things are finding the right things to focus on, and finding enough hours in the day to focus on.
Well, Melinda Zabriskie, want to thank you for spending time with Used Car News. Again, always appreciate Experience Help providing us data, and of course for our upcoming data source book digitally. Obviously look for our data source book and look for Experience information, which is always solid gold. And again, appreciate your time spending with us, and I hope you have a great next year as well.
At the beginning of 2022, economists told this paper to expect a strong first quarter, vehicle shortages, and inflation. Sounds about right. The chip shortage dominated the news, and new car stores featured miles of pavement early in the year. New car shortages challenged both auctions and dealerships. Inventory shortages trickled down from franchise stores to auctions and then the used car lot. The year started out right as live conventions kicked off in March with the National Automobile Dealers Association and the Conference of Automotive Remarketing, both holding shows in Las Vegas. The push for electric vehicles continued to grow, and the trade shows all made room for discussions on EVs. The National Auto Auction Association had one of the more helpful discussions on the issue. The panel went past the typical discussions of battery range to talk about how EVs will affect life in an auction. How to set up charging stations, how much to charge an EV leaving the sale, how will the weight of the battery affect transportation. This was the year the industry grappled with the broader challenges of EVs in the lanes and on the lots. Inventory shortages pushed prices as high as SpaceX, and they stayed there for a good chunk of the year. Independent dealers who have been squeezed for inventory by franchise dealers for the better part of a decade had to become even more creative to acquire cars. During the first quarter, sales were strong regardless of prices. The heated market made dealership values peak in the first half of 2022. According to the Blue Sky report by Kerrigan Advisors, average dealership Blue Sky values increased to a new record of $12.1 million, a $5.7 million increase in Blue Sky value since 2019, largely driven by record dealership earnings. For the 12 months ending June of this year, the average dealership earned an estimated $4.3 million, a 207% increase over the pre-pandemic average. Through the first three quarters, 369 dealerships were acquired. By the fourth quarter, the buy-sell market had cooled a bit. Acquisitions, which were strong in 2021, hit a peak when Carvana agreed to shell out more than $2 billion for ADESA's physical auctions. Regulators and attorneys also kept busy. In June, the FTC proposed a rule to ban junk fees and bait-and-switch advertising tactics. The rule would also ban fraudulent junk fees for so-called fraudulent add-on products and services that provide no benefit to consumers. Other changes would ban surprise junk fees and require full upfront disclosure of costs and conditions. A charitable organization founded by the Colorado Independent Automobile Dealers Association raised $422,000 during its 2022 charity gala in Westminster, Colorado. The Used Car Dealers of Colorado Charity Fund is in its 9th year, and the gala, which was held last month, is its signature event. Dean Gunter, the past president of CIADA, serves as auctioneer for the event. Gunter said the charity and the gala were created to provide for some of the local needs in Colorado. The main event features live and silent auctions with bidding on items from various sponsors. The generosity is always surprising. One grill brought in $6,300 alone. As part of that $422,000 total, the group also targets a local charity in what it calls its Fund a Need effort. This year's Fund a Need went to the Charity Angels of America's Fallen. The Colorado Springs-based charity offers support and help to children of fallen service members. The Fund a Need fundraiser comes at the end of the gala and is simply a paddle raiser where people raise a paddle to offer a donation to that specific charity. $76,000 was raised in the Fund a Need effort. In 2022, the industry lost two icons. Industry pioneer and former Columbus Fair auto auction owner Alexis Jacobs died on June 3rd. She was 80 years old. Jacobs grew up in the auction business after her father, William Jacobs, established Columbus Fair Auto Auction in 1958, one of the country's largest independent auto auctions. From her father's passing in 1982, she served as owner and chief executive officer until 2019. Jacobs was a founding partner of Used Car News. She served as National Auto Auction Association president in 1995, received the NAAA Industry Pioneer in 2011, and was inducted into the NAAA Hall of Fame in 2014. In addition, Jacobs received the Columbus Automobile Dealers Association Automotive Achievement Award and was inducted into the National Independent Automobile Dealers Association Ring of Honor. Donald Foss, founder of Credit Acceptance Corp. And CarRight, died on August 14th. Foss made a fortune in the subprime and buy here, pay here industry before retiring in 2017. Forbes recently listed Foss on its billionaire list worth $1.9 billion. In 2015, he spoke at the National Buy Here, Pay Here Dealers Alliance Conference in Orlando as he received the Buy Here, Pay Here Hall of Fame Award. Fellow dealer and MC Ingram Walters introduced Foss, talking about his humble beginnings as an independent dealer, where he started with a dirt lot which he rented for $35. Thanks for listening to Used Car News Podcast. Each month we'll bring you fast and reliable news that car dealers can rely on for this evolving industry. For a free subscription of Used Car News, please go to usedcarnews.com. This podcast is a production of BG Ad Group. Make sure to share us on social media and like and follow wherever you get your podcasts.